and welcome everybody. So my name is Lenny Ureña Valerio, and I'm the Associate Director for Program Development. Thank you so much for joining this event. And Kelsey?
Yeah, welcome everyone. My name is Kelsey Barisco, and I am so happy that we have Jocelyn here today for our speaker. She's one of my friends and peers in our graduate program. So I just have a quick announcement and then I'll pass it over to Jessica. I am a graduate assistant with a program called New Mexico Humanities Now, and this is a support program between CNM and UNM to support transfer students, specifically in the humanities. And so this program offers mentorship to students who are interested in transfer or who have recently transferred to UNM. We have different events. I helped to organize this speaker talk, and these events are in about 12 different departments, also in Native American Studies, English, philosophy, etc. And so we have, we have different speakers. We also have different workshops to share about the resources for students who are interested in transfer. And then one of the other opportunities we offer is a summer academy. And so this is an opportunity for students who are either interested in transferring to UNM or recently transferred from CNM to take 2 upper division courses at UNM. And so the courses that are offered this summer are Community, Memory, and Vitality, which will run June 6th to June 24th, and Literature and Culture. And that one runs June 27th to July 23rd. So these are opportunities to take upper division courses and to get credit for your AA at CNM and your BA at UNM. And also students who participate will get a $1,000 stipend upon completion. So I'm going to share the website for New Mexico Humanities Now and also my email in the chat. And if anyone's interested in getting more information, let me know. And thank you so much, Jocelyn, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you, Kelsey. Hello, everybody, and again, welcome. Thanks so much for being here, especially Jocelyn. We're so excited about your talk. So my name is Jessica Craig, and I teach at CNM. I'm a faculty member in Anthropology and in Latin American Studies. And I want to take just a brief moment to kind of highlight some of the things we do in Latin American Studies at CNM. Some of our, the greatest hits. We offer a range of courses. We have an associate's degree in Latin American Studies. So in addition to sort of the intro course in Latin American Studies, we have a really great Latin American film class that's offered at least once a year. I don't think it's offered every term, but we offer it annually. And then we have a range of topics classes. Those vary year to year. But there's some really exciting ones from faculty, really from kind of all over CNM. We sort of encourage that. And so the one we're working on now that's on the books for this coming academic year is going to be co-taught by myself and Brandon Morgan, who teaches in history and Latin American Studies as well. And in it, we're going to compare Santa Fe and Antigua, Guatemala, as these sort of weird, interesting parallel cities, these kind of constructed cities based on this shared history of colonialism, but also this emphasis on tourism and how that's so intimately tied to that colonial history. So these interesting constructed places and geographically distinct regions, but sharing a lot in common. So we thought that would be an interesting class. So we're very excited about it. But that's the kind of thing where these topics classes vary every year. And then also, I think one of the most exciting things we do, we offer a study abroad program at CNM through Latin American Studies. Right now, we're focused on Antigua, Guatemala. We took students a few years ago and it was fantastic. It's just a 10-day trip. We take about 10 students. 10 days makes it affordable and manageable. So it's not a whole semester, but it's a great introduction to a new place, an extraordinary place. And so we're very excited because, of course, we haven't done it in a few years, but we're on the books for a go to do it next year in 2023 in the spring. So we will start advertising for that this fall, but I will put my email in the chat. And if anyone is interested in more information about that, I'm happy to elaborate. And so, yeah, I think that's about it for Latin American Studies. Again, if I can answer any questions, just shoot me an email. And so what I want to do without further ado is introduce Jocelyn. Again, we're so happy to have you. Thank you again. And I'm just going to, if it's okay with you, I'll just read your bio, put my glasses on as a brief introduction. So Joselin Castillo is a second-year MA student in the Latin American Studies program at UNM. She received a BA in Anthropology, and a minor in Women, Gender, and Sexuality at California State University, Los Angeles. Coming from a Guatemalan immigrant family and raised by a single mother, her research is focused on the experience of Central American mothering, influenced by the caregivers in her life and the complex networks of communal caregiving. Her research focuses on intersectionality and transnational identity through the form of autoethnography. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Jocelyn. Again, if you have questions, we want to wait until the end so you can put them in the chat as you think of them, and I'll keep track. Or of course, at the end, if you want to do the hand raise icon, you can ask Jocelyn yourself. There you go. Thanks, Jocelyn.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here today, and Jessica and Kelsey for organizing this, along with Lenny. I see a lot of familiar faces here, so I'm happy that you're all here. I will give a quick disclaimer if my computer freezes. A few of you may know I've been having issues with it. I'll be back in a minute. So let me figure out how to share my PowerPoint and then I can get started. I have a question. Does anyone know how to like do full screen on here while also having another, I guess, like a Word document up?
What happens when you do like at the bottom, when you make it full screen? Like when is it not? Oh, so you want another document open.
Yeah.
A good question.
Does this work?
Yeah.
It works, yes.
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, cool. So once again, my name is Jocelyn. I'm currently an MA student at in the Latin American Studies department at UNM, but I'm currently on my last semester. So this is the project that I'm presenting today that I'm leading up to is actually my MA paper. And so I'll be done this spring. And this paper is kind of in the works. So I'm gonna go through a bit of like the background as to how I got to my research and then discuss a little bit about like what's going on in my mind with the paper. It's currently being edited and reworked, and just like research, it's always tangled and it's always untangling, and then it tangles again and you keep untangling. So I guess that's also what's kind of kept me here. So my work is called, for now, on Central American Women in the Workforce. And so first, I want to give a bit of a roadmap just so you all know like what I'm going to be talking about today. And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce what my research is about. Or how I got to start research to begin with, because research isn't necessarily inherent, you know, or at least in the form that we do it in like in school and academia. So then after I'm going to discuss a bit about my family, my personal history and my family's histories, because it's all very much interrelated. And then even the question of like, how did I get into research? Because research wasn't necessarily a thing that I had in mind. in my education. I didn't know what that looked like. I didn't know what that was. And here I am in my master's program. And then kind of to show a little bit the development of my work. So the progression of how it's like developed from like my undergrad and then now in my program and what I plan to do in the future. But more specifically, I'm going to be going into how just explaining a bit about my current paper and give you like an example exactly afterward, I will show where I am now, what I'm thinking about doing with my research and basically in my future, my near future, because like I said, research is very much, it's very different and not necessarily, I wouldn't consider it like the most natural thing, but because it's also related to like my personal histories, I'm using it to kind of like describe the experience of like Central American families. So I just want to give like a quick overview, just make sure that we're kind of all on a similar page. So right here we have a map of Central America, and I think it's always been very helpful to like share it with the people or like the audience, just because there's always a big misconception or like there's confusions about what where Central America is at, what that consists of. And so we have a map right here on the left. And so Central America starts where the blue and the green are at, so between Guatemala and Belize, and then going all the way down south to Panama. So it's between Mexico and South America. So usually Central America gets kind of like a little bit disappeared just because it's like right in between, it's really small, it's the isthmus, but more specifically for my research purposes, I'm focusing on Guatemala and El Salvador, and I can go ahead and talk about that a little bit later. And so my research starts at this point in the 1970s because it was a very pivotal point for the development of the region. So in the 1970s, we saw massive like restructuring of the economies. So there was a lot of like foreign investment that was being done in Central America, particularly by the United States. And so it was a very like volatile time because there's also like changes within the government. There's a lot of conflict, and more specifically, this is a time where civil war really bursted out throughout the region. And so as a result, there was a revolution, but it was during the time of like the Cold War. So US intervention was really, I guess, a big part of what happened in Central America because they were trying to fight against communism. And so as a result, the US was fueling militaries, and it really caused more tension within the regions as they were going through their own like political revolutions and changes within their governments. And so the military, when it comes to civil war and the military, there tends to be a lot of gendered violence. So we see that along a lot of militarized zones and along the US border, which is also very much in that militarized kind of style. And so I focus on that because there was a pretty big wave of migration from the 1980s during the start of the civil wars. I mean, some wars lasted longer than others. In Guatemala, it was from 1954 until 1992. And so that lasted quite a while. And in El Salvador, it was from like the 1970s through the 1980s. And so as we see right here, there's like a chart from the 1980s showing how many migrants like migrated from these regions from Central America to the United States. So in the 1980s, there's 354,000. And then if you progress through the years, there were changes within there were natural disasters, there were changes in migration policy that ultimately affected how Central Americans can get to the United States and what that looked like. And later or more recent like times, in 2017, there were over 3.5 million migrants in the US. And it will continue to grow as we see changes with climate change, which will also impact this region. So that's why I bring up this conversation of like the regions of Central America, because it is going to be very relevant. It is very relevant and will continue to be relevant. And so that's why I'm discussing how Central Americans are really portrayed, because there seems to be a disconnect between how they're perceived in the media and how and their actual lived experiences. So just to give an overview about the research that I do, I focus on the Central American diaspora, and like more specifically, what I mean by diaspora is that there's been the exile of a specific community or political associations or just cultural associations that have been pushed out of their home countries or their regions. And more specifically, Central American diaspora didn't only land in the United States, and that a lot of people ended up moving to other parts of the world. So that's something I'm interested in looking at. You know, they've also went to Canada, to Spain, even to Australia. And so more specifically, I focus on like the spatial imaginaries of Central American families. And what I mean by spatial imaginaries is how Central Americans navigate these spaces. So if they move in, if they have their own understanding of their world back in their home country, whether it comes to like how they navigate the economy, how they navigate that day to day, how they navigate gender, or how they're perceived as by their gender or by their job, how do they settle into a new place and navigate their own understandings of themselves with the understandings of that region. So I hope I explained that pretty okay. If you have any questions, just feel free to ask too. So I did talk about how I want to expand outside of the US region. Throughout different US regions, usually it's focused, and a lot of Central American migrants landed in Los Angeles and in the East Coast by Washington, DC. But I want to look a little bit into like different areas. Like here in Albuquerque, I found pockets of Central Americans too, and that's actually very common where growing up in Los Angeles, I felt very much kind of isolated from other Central Americans, especially it was a very multicultural area that I grew up in. But when it came to being Latin American, or usually it would be associated with being Mexican. So as I got older, maybe in high school, we would be like, hey, you're Guatemalan too, or you're half Salvi. So like, I think it's important to address that we are out here and we're everywhere. And luckily I've been able to find some people out here in Albuquerque. And so more specifically in my paper, I focus on like the perceptions of Central American women in labor forces, such as particularly maquiladoras and the domestic services. So that includes like housekeeping, childcare, caregiving. And so next, I'm going to talk about a little bit about my personal history, just so you all know how I got to my research, because it's very integral to how I position myself between all of it. Usually research is seen as like, oh, you have to be objective, you can't be connected to it, but my reality is very much intertwined with the work that I do. So here is a picture of me and my family. So that is my mom, and then my 3 older sisters, and I'm the little baby right there. So this is taken back in the 90s. So my family migrated from Guatemala in 1992. And so my mom, along with my sisters and my father. And so at some point, my mom and my dad separated, and I was born too around that time. So what that meant was that my mom had to raise 4 children on her own. And also understanding that her experience, or my mother's experience, was very much like drastically changed within a series of a year or 2. So coming from Guatemala, she would take care of my sisters. She was kind of more of like a stay-at-home mom, but she also like found ways to make her own money. She was very much strategic. Since she was little, she would go out and sell bread. She liked to have a little bit of extra cash on her. And when she was raising my sisters in the 80s, she would raise cattle and just like sell pigs, just so she can have her own personal like financial security, aside from like the income that my dad would bring into the family. And so for her, shifting to being a single mom was very much like she was prepared, I guess a little bit more prepared mentally, that she felt her sole responsibility to take care of her children. And with that said, there were like changes in like the family dynamics. So my mom worked at a garment factory, which is also a maquiladora, and she worked in LA. And so what that meant for my sisters and I was that my mom would be at work for about 60 hours a day. Oh, no, not a day, a week. That's about 60 hours a week. And so a lot of the times my sisters will help take care of me. They were a lot older than me, so they would help take care of me. And my mom had a lot of support through like our neighbors, like a lot of people knew of her circumstances. So that's when I talk about communal care, that's what I'm talking about. How families and family dynamics can be very much different than what is expected of the nuclear family with the mom and the dad and then the children. So that's what I mean about like spatial imaginaries, how there's different ways of understanding the world and navigating the world. And with my family, it was very much through that communal care. So in this slide, I like to share this because growing up, I would go with my mom to work sometimes over the summer. So she worked at a garment factory in Long Beach, and usually in Los Angeles, my family did migrate specifically to Los Angeles right after Guatemala. So this is where it's always been at. And so usually you think of garment factories, you think of like downtown LA. And but my mom worked in Long Beach. And so what she did there is she would basically work in an assembly line and trim off loose ends off of clothing. So I would just go with my little, like the little toy computers that children have with like a few games on there. I would take that and then I would go with her to work. And in the left, the left picture is actually where she worked at. And then on the right is also like another location where they would send, like, for example, jeans to be like ironed down, and then it would be sent to like the distributor. And so, that's a very interesting experience being a child, hanging out with my mom at the garment factory, and then seeing her friends that she would always talk about. And so like, I think that was very like, that influenced how I decided to feel about how I would do my research, just because it was so like, it was a lived experience, kind of seeing my mom go through that. And so, from a child, I've always very much liked school, and my mom would always tell me, you need to go to school, you need to do well. And although I feel like there was this understanding that school is important, it's also trying to understand, how do I get through school? My sisters also went to school here in the United States and started working right after high school, just because at some point my mom did injure her shoulder, and she was forced to retire because she couldn't do that kind of labor. And so my sisters had to step up and really take care of our family finances. So for them, trying to pursue like higher education came a lot later in their lives as they were trying to navigate their circumstances. So for me, watching my sisters work and also attend school, I also wanted to pursue higher education. That's kind of what is drilled in your head, like especially like K through 12. And I particularly went to LAUSD, so they would tell us, go to school, do well, attend higher education. But the resources were also very much lacking. And how do you like bridge those gaps together? And so at some point, I was able to meet this really fantastic college counselor at my high school, who really encouraged me and taught me how to navigate, how to apply to schools. And my sisters really did set that example for me to attend school. But at the time, they're still navigating community college, and my counselor was telling me to go to the university. So I was accepted, and I was able to attend a 4-year. And so my family was very much supportive of that, but it was also it was unfamiliar. And so I ended up doing my undergrad at Cal State LA. So I originally applied to study anthropology, but I was more interested in like the biological, like anthropology. I wanted to study hominids and like the evolution of humans. But over time, I was able to get my feet into like a little bit of like different like subjects in anthropology. But like what was really pivotal for me here was I was able to apply for a fellowship, and that was the Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship, which really helped shift my attention to research. So I didn't know what research was. I remember my first quarter at Cal State LA, and one of the instructors from my English class was telling us, oh, by the way, you can go to school and you can stay until you could do a PhD, which is like 5 years. And in my head, I was like, who would even do that? That's ridiculous. You know, like I made it here, I'm going to be here for 4 years and I'm out. And here I am in my 6th year of higher education. And it was really, at least for me, the beginning of my undergrad was very much like, it was very confusing because I didn't know how to navigate at least higher education, and my fellowship was very pivotal, and I joined that in my 4th year as an undergrad, and it really the program was to support me into, I thought I wanted to become a professor. I didn't know what that meant too much, and then this fellowship was like, we'll help undergrads become professors and diversify the fields of the social sciences and the humanities, and that's exactly where I ended up, and my research really developed. I had different ideas of what I wanted to do, but at some point, I think Enriquez here was kind of like, hey, you know, actually that sounds like a great idea. You should do, I think I was talking about my mom, and he's like, you should focus on Central American mothering. And that's exactly what I did in the 2 years in this program. And so another factor that really like helped me shape my interest in Central American studies was learning about like my histories, my family's histories, and like really contextualizing what it meant to be Central American in the US. And Cal State LA was also very much there are a lot of Central Americans in Cal State, like compared to like how isolated I felt growing up. So that was very helpful. And so the first project that I did as an undergrad was called the Pedagogy of Central American Mothering in the Age of Gendered Anti-Immigrant Policies. So I'm just gonna go over this a bit. I'm gonna talk about it. I don't know if I'll explain it like super in depth, but just like to highlight some like key points. So when I thought of this project, I was trying to understand like what it meant to be like a Central American mother, just because I personally felt that I was not just raised by like my mom, but my sisters also took certain roles in like mothering in different ways, you know. And I really wanted to understand like, I mean, there's kind of like a disconnect in my head. I was like, how did I come up with these questions? If I was very much lost, but I focused on how is knowledge shared and acknowledged by Central American mothers? What is the relationship between mothers and daughters in teaching mothering practices? And how does mothering play forms of resistance of gender roles after migrating to the United States? So those are like my larger like research questions. And I think that being raised by like my mom and my sisters really helped me think of like how is like knowledge shared, especially if you're a teenager trying to play the role of a mother. How is that information really, or like how do you teach that to a certain degree? And so like I guess one thing I want to clarify is like when it comes to pedagogy, it's like what are the teaching practices that are being used to share information, more specifically like cultural and generational information. And so when it comes to like the Central American rhetoric of how Central American families and women are viewed on the media, I mean, most recently, like seeing the crisis at the border and seeing these families, not just families, but seeing children at the US border or children with mothers, it really shapes this picture that there's this like negligence of their roles as parents for bringing them to such a harmful place, but understanding that the conditions, there are certain conditions in Central America that cause gendered violence. There's war, there's a lot of political like turbulency, and because of that, there's a necessity to leave. Although my family's situation was a bit different, it was more economically motivated. This is a reality that's out there, and so I thought it was like it was like really good timing with what was coming out in the media, is to really see how are these family dynamics really shifting. And one of the things that I discovered through my research, through this research project, and I will let you know, I based this on my family. So I interviewed my mom and two of my sisters who have children. One of my sisters, her son was 15 or 16 years old. And my other sister had a child who had just turned like 1 or 2. So to just kind of put in context, like the role, the dynamics with my family, you know, we have a grandmother, we have the first oldest nephew, and then we have a child, you know, like a baby essentially. And so one thing that I discovered in asking questions to my family was that teaching is nonlinear. So there's always this like relationship where it's not like mother to daughter teaching, but it's also like the children and the mom. So it's a lot of like bouncing back ideas. And that's how I particularly emphasize that, because we often think that there's this like power dynamic or relationship between like the parent and the child. And so another thing that I also discovered, which is also why I have this picture of this tamal. I chose the Guatemalan tamal for this because there's this theme that kept popping up, was this idea that you just have to know. So when it came to things such as like reproductive health or just even learning how to make a recipe, my mom would very much be like, you know, if you want to learn how to make tamales, you have to come and watch. You can't participate. Don't even interrupt the process. You just have to sit there and learn how I learned it just by watching. And then once you know how to do it, then you can do it yourself. And so that was one of the things that I that I really wanted to focus on in my research, was because when I did get feedback from other people who also grew up in that Central American families, they are also like, my mom's the same way too. She won't let me touch anything. And I, to this day, I think I went back for Christmas, and I asked my mom, can I learn this year? And she's like, okay. And then it's 7 in the morning and she'll just start. She won't even tell you the time or the date. It's like, you better be there. You better be ready to learn if you really want to learn. And that's how she experienced that. So how did I get into my current work? Just give me a second. I'm getting a little thirsty. So when I went into my MA program, I was very much thinking about what my dissertation would look like. So I plan on doing my PhD and really expanding on my work of like Central American mothering. So when it comes to Central American mothering, I could see that being like a chapter in like my dissertation. I'm shooting high, maybe a book in the future. So right now I'm kind of teasing through the ideas and like the different angles where I can focus on. And like, even though when I talked about Central American mothering, I discussed it more like, oh, women can be mothers, but also I want to explore how mothering and the practice of mothering doesn't have to be specific to women. Anyone could mother. And I noticed that within my research, and I hope to expand on that later, because that's a whole other thing that I would need to tackle. And so during my MA, I was really much like, okay, what else do I focus on? I focused on Central American mothering, which was still a big part of my work, but where do I go on from here? And so I decided to focus on, I've noticed I've written a couple papers from undergrad and later on about how Central American women are perceived in labor. And then I decided to piece together like these larger ideas from like, how are they depicted in movies, how are they depicted on the news, how are they depicted in like readings. And right here I have I chose these 2 pictures for this slide just because like when you search up like Central American mothers on Google, these are the kind of pictures that come up. You know, this is like style of like these women are helpless, there's a lot of domesticity. And while it's true that there is a lot of violence and a lot of like hardships that they need to navigate, you know, there's another side to the story, and that's kind of where I'm really trying to touch on. And so, like I said, I focus on post-1970s because this was a very pivotal time in how the economies changed in Central America, which forced migration out of the region, on top of the civil wars, which also forced people to leave the region in fear for their lives. And more specifically, during this time, there was a shift in gendered migration. So why women migrated out of Central America was a very specific phenomenon. And so in this paper, so I argue that the proliferation of global economies, so like the introduction of like transnational companies, and we see that through like maquiladoras entering the space, shape the ways in which Central American women are conceptualized in the media. So for example, these pictures, like how are Central American women like depicted? And because of this, there's a disconnect between the lived experiences of gendered labor, more specifically women leaving Central America to fill in certain jobs in the US, and that also counts as like domestic labor. And so that's in the domestic sector and the maquiladoras. So some of the questions that I focused on in this paper is how is space created by Central American women in the workforce? Are Central American women, how are they introduced into their field of work? And how do Central American women understand themselves, understanding their previous roles in the workspace? So they have different like gendered expectations of what labor looks like back home, and how do they envision themselves in these new spaces as they're leaving their hometowns and they're migrating across borders and entering these spaces that are very much different. And so in this paper, I do a media analysis. So this is where my work has very much changed over the years. So I am now I'm very intersectional when it comes to my work. So I focus on like gender studies, but I also have an interest more recently in my MA, which I never thought would have happened, was a focus on art and art history. It's been very pivotal in like helping me understand how the role of Central American media is really important in like framing their rhetoric. And so also geography, the field of geography has been very influential in understanding what spatial imaginaries are, and also history, and like I would like to look a little bit more into like what the archives look like, and maybe in like the 1980s of how women were portrayed during the Civil War in like newspapers per se. So that's a little bit later on. So in this paper, I focus on 3 pieces. One of them is Falso Franca by Delia Chavez, which is an installation by the Salvadoran woman who kind of, I'll show a bit more about it after, but it's a depiction of Central American woman at a maquiladora. The next piece is Hard Work Alone is Not Enough by Lacey Abrego, and this is a chapter in the book US Central Americans. It's a really good book. So if anyone's interested, I recommend that one. It's a lot easier to digest, and especially it could be very relatable. And then the third analysis in my paper is a testimony of my mother. So how was her experience working at a garment factory in Los Angeles, and just, really triangulating these 3 sources and seeing the conversation that comes out of it. So one of the things that I focused on was like neoliberalism. So how did the changes in the economies in Central America during a specific time affect how women navigated their own like economic trajectories? And when it comes to transnationalism, this idea that there's an interconnection between Central America, and more specific in this paper, and the US, and how there's this, it's not like from point A to point B. It's very much point A to B to A to B. It's very much back and forth. So what are the relationships between transnational families that are separated, and more specifically, I talk about like the economy, how the economy really pushed a lot of this migration and like gendered violence at the same time. And one of the things that I did want to highlight is this thing called remittance culture. So as a child, I remember going with my mom, we would walk to like this like bank called like Western Union, and it was at this grocery store called La Guanajuato, and we would just go and I was like, oh, we're gonna send money. And to this day, we would send money back home. And so I guess a big part of understanding gender migration is there's this culture where Central American moms will send money back to provide for the children, provide for their families. And so I think that's like an important part of this work, because remittance culture does perform a really big part in the GDPs in these countries. So, and it's not something, it's not low key. Everyone, the US knows it's happening, the countries over there know it's happening. So there's obviously like a disruption in the ways people are making money and how they're able to make money and how much. And a lot of it has to do with the extraction and exploitation, low wages, long hours that are being forced on or provided as forms of labor in the region. And more specifically, gendered migration, how during this period there was this not just within Central America, but globally, with globalization and like these like transnational like economies, how labor has very much become gendered to the sense where women's labor is needed in certain spaces in the world, and we see that through like people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds migrating to go work for another family, and just trying to navigate in these like northern parts of the world that hold more wealth, not because they are developing faster, but they're developing because of their reliance on countries such as Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras. And so just to give you all an example very briefly of like the analysis that I'm doing in this paper, I look at the gendered labor aesthetics of Delia Chavez's work, because it really depicts what a maquiladora looks like in the eyes of a Central American woman. And another thing that I want to point out is that Delia Chavez is a Central American woman. Lecia Abrego is a Central American woman. And then I'm also a Central American woman talking about my mom. I'm US Central American. So like, it's not how is the media looking at Central American women, but how are Central American women talking about other Central American women? And I just really wanted to clarify that. And so Delia Chavez is a Salvadoran artist. And she, in this piece, she decided to, she interviewed women at maquiladoras in El Salvador and look into how these women were really like navigating these spaces and their encounters. So on the left, you can see several rows of like little figurines, and each one of them is supposed to symbolize a woman working on manufacturing, and they're manufacturing in large amounts and they're creating clothes. So the woman on the right, as you can see, has what looks like jeans. And so if you look at a lot of your clothing, a lot of it does come from Central America. And just look at the tags. You'll find a couple articles in your closet like that. So they also have like a sewing machine. So, and the fact that there's like over 100 figurines just kind of shows that the line of production has to be it is like really fast manufacturing. And like more specifically, I can't show you just because finding pictures of this piece has been kind of hard for me, but each figurine is actually very like individual. So every person working has like different characteristics, like different hair, makeup, clothing. And on the right, you actually see this woman, she appears to be pregnant. And so it just kind of comes to show how I guess the environment in these places really, even though each woman has individual lives and individual circumstances, it very much erases all of that by putting them all line by line by line. And there's actually a really interesting like component of this piece. There's actually, if you zoom out after seeing the rows, there's a picture of a camera, kind of like a surveillance camera looking over, like a really large surveillance camera looking all over the figurines. And I can't find that picture, and I wish I could show you all. But like one of the things that I do analyze in this piece is that each like figurine has like a bumper around it and it's red. So like, and they're all not touching. So I look into like the symbolism of that. So like it comes to like, there's this idea of control. You have to stay within your bubble. You can't talk to the person next to you. There's this domesticity that's being like portrayed by the room around them and by having them lined up in rows, but also looking forward and specifically at their work. And then another part that I also look at is how were these pieces manufactured? And luckily there's a pretty cool interview where Delia Chavez talks about how she actually hired someone to mold the figurines for her and she painted it. And she talks about how these particular artisans, Artesantos de lo Vasco, which are very like famous in the country, didn't want any credit from it. But they're just like, even her producing this work is also paying someone to manufacture it. But she did mention, she's like, I wanted to pay them well, just because the nature of this work is like, there's low wages, there's a lot of energy being used to produce this work. And so like, just because we're coming closer to time, this piece, after she interviewed these women, there are a lot of themes of like, there's a major necessity to work, but there's also this like understanding of flexibility. If you don't like one maquiladora, you can move to another and, kind of negotiate your way. And like compared to like, I use this to compare to like my mom's experience. She never was like, I don't like the place that I'm working at. She did understand some of the conditions weren't like the best, but she was also able to work at several different types of factories, like an electronic factory, and then working like assembling electronics, and then working at a garment factory, cutting off loose ends, like trimming off loose ends from clothing. And so there's this like aesthetic that is being like produced here by Delia Chavez, which is very different from like seeing women at the border, and in addition to that, there's also, it would be interesting to look at the stories of like individual women in like different spaces. So like in Central American maquiladoras, and then the women who are working in the United States in similar kind of labor. And when we think of maquiladoras, it's also important to highlight that we think of like, Ciudad Juarez during the 1990s, during this period of femicide, where a lot of the women who were working at this like newly built factories along the border, it was all women really working there, and there was a lot of control. So to be able to shift that maquiladoras aren't just like, at least for a while, it was known as Mexican women, and now it's Central American. Central American women have also been participating in this, and it's not just in Central America. They're all, wherever like your clothing, the tag is from, there's someone working there, and a lot of it pertains to gendered labor. And so I'm just gonna leave it as that, just because there's a lot more that I could like talk about, but just to kind of like wrap up where I'm at. So when it comes to my work, like, I guess I continue to do my work just because it's very like personal, and like, even though research is very difficult, it's a headache, it's easy to get lost, just like being able to connect with, like, there are parts when I do like have interviews with my family, or if I talk to people or something like it really gives me like the drive to be like, well, my work can really become alive with collaboration with my family members and my community, because at the end of the day, it's a collaboration. It's my work, but not my work. It's everyone's story being pieced together. And, just to talk about like Central America and like the general Latin American region, it's often, forgotten, or it's not really understood what is going on in this area. They're just like a whole bunch of migrants coming to the US border and just trying to come over and work, and there's a lot of that rhetoric. So by doing my work, I hope to create like more visibility in like the issues for Central America and Central American migrants, more specifically Central American migration, just because that is a bit more what I'm familiar with. And so it really complicates what Central American identity looks like, just because it's very complicated. There's a lot of migration back and forth. There's no migration at times either, the option to migrate or to visit back home. And so I want to look later into like how do like specific like policies created by Central American governments and US, and like right now like more thinking US migration policy, how does that feed into the necropolitics of the Central American diaspora? And what I mean by that is how is the government implementing certain policies that cause the early death of a specific group, and that would be the Central American diaspora. But also on the lighter side, I want to look at how this idea of like transnationalism, how does that change how Central American families understand love? What does love look like, and how is that shared? And so, and now the last question is, where will I continue my work? I have to decide by tomorrow where I will commit, what school I will commit to for my doctoral program. So I hope this is all, it's very messy, but I hope you're all able to grasp something from it. And thank you all for listening. And let me know, just feel free to ask any questions, and I hope I can be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. That's really, and it's really inspiring. And it's so exciting that you have to make this hard decision. I mean, hard, but exciting at the same time. So do you mind unsharing your screen? I mean, unless we need to go back to a slide, I guess, but is that okay for now? And then if folks have questions, we have a couple of minutes. You're welcome to type them in the chat, or you're welcome, to just ask the question, whichever is best for you. Lots of thank yous in the chat. Thank you so much for sharing your life journey, from Jennifer.
Yeah, no, thank you all for listening.
I did have one question, and if you didn't address it, so I apologize if it's like, it's kind of a curiosity, I guess. But I was thinking about this double standard on women in the US and elsewhere in relation to work that's put on them, right? In terms of being a quote unquote good mother, responsible mother, but also having to work. And I wondered, given the communal care, the system of communal care that is, in place with your upbringing, but obviously in place in Central America too, perhaps more so than in the US. Like, did you see any of that, or is that something you see changing? Do you see more pressures on women after having moved to the US? Yeah, do you see that double standard kind of manifesting, or not so much?
It's something that I'm actually really curious to look into. I feel like I think more specifically, like based on like the region that they come from, there's like different, like specific gendered expectations in each country. So I feel like at least from one person I interviewed, there was not really any like shame as to like why she decided to migrate to the US and leave one of her daughters back home with her grandma. And so, but I guess like if I'm answering it correctly, I feel like there is a shift in like, because having these discussions really cause like that shift in like the conversation of like what's expected of a mom. And I don't know, I think I kind of lost I lost the question a little bit, but I'd want to know a bit more about that. And that's what I'm hoping to do during my dissertation, is being able to interview a lot more families and just kind of see where they're at and what's like overlapping.
Yeah, and when I was asking the question, I was rambling. I was like, well, what am I really asking? But it's just, it occurred to me a couple of times, this system of communal care, and how unique it is and how important it is. But I wonder if if it will suffer any changes, maybe because of this migration. So anyway, just curious. But there are other people with questions. So I'm going to ask Philip's question, and then Enrique is raising his hand, if that's okay, Enrique, because I just saw it pop up first. So Philip is asking, have you looked into the small loans that organizations are facilitating to Central American women? There's Philip. Hi, Philip.
Not specifically, but if I'm understanding it, well, I know there's like initiatives like throughout like South America and specific like nonprofits that will like provide like money so women can create their own businesses. So that would be something interesting to look at for sure. Like I do want to have a portion where I do get to go to Central America and really see what that looks like, you know, from the root of it. But thank you for sharing that.
And then Enrique, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, great, thank you. Congratulations, Jocelyn. That was exciting to see and hear and really to see, right, how your work evolves. Catherine and I are sitting here listening to this. Catherine is a Hondureña student who was excited, wanted to hear what you had to say.
How's it going, Catherine?
We were commenting, right, on the power of Central American women's, right, kind of narratives and the centering of their narratives, right, that you do both with your mother's narrative and of course your narrative connected to your mother's and your other mothers, right, your sisters as other mothers, but also with the artist, right, with Lacey Abrego's work. And then the testimonial. And again, I think, you know, it's so crucial. And again, I know you talked about it and the importance of it and how that contrasts with these dominating narratives or these narratives, right? These, what do they call? Controlling narratives that Patricia Hill Collins talks about. And your juxtaposition really is so powerful. Again, I just want to say a little bit more about that. And maybe any critiques you might get because of the centering of Central American women who are vilified generally, right, in our society. But, you know, you don't have to answer either. Thank you.
Do you mind rephrasing that question once more? I just need to listen to it once more.
So it was just a comment. It wasn't really a kind of question, but it was really more about if you want to talk a little bit more about the importance of centering the Central American women's narratives and
Okay.
especially in this kind of context of criminalization. I mean, you're very intentional in doing so, and you intentionally mentioned it. So maybe you want to say a little bit more about it.
Yeah, no, sure. I remember when I first started doing my research, when I would look at articles, I remember running into one article about how there was a study of how Central American children in preschool were more like, I guess, what would be the word? They're like more calm, they're more easy to control, they're more like docile compared to other children. And there's this association of, because they're Central American, they're more docile. And a lot of that does relate to like understanding how Central American women are being told to be docile, and on top of that, even if they're not, they're still portrayed in a way. So I guess like just like, you know, Enrique really help center my work in focusing on like the narratives of Central American women. It's very much different in the way where a lot of work produced about Central Americans in general are not produced by Central Americans, and Central American women becoming a little bit more scarce. And then we focus on even having Central American women at the center. And I think that's very important because that's a lot more powerful than looking at statistics. And some people might say otherwise, but if whoever resonates for, I think that's what's most important. And I think it doesn't just resonate towards the Central American diaspora, but a whole bunch of other communities where mothers are very much at the center of the family. And it's a lot of labor, for sure, different kinds of labor. And it's also trying to understand, what does labor even look like? What does labor even mean? And so when it comes to like the US or like the very like neoliberal sense of labor, this is very much understanding that existence transcends these like global processes, for sure. Thank you, Enrique.
Are there any other quickish questions. We're at time, but I don't want to shoot anybody down if they have a burning question. And I will take a minute while I wait a sec. I have your work is so important. Maybe you can see this too, Jocelyn. Great presentation, very interesting and informative. Love the family stories. Lots of accolades. Thank you for sharing your life journey. Beautiful discussion. So,
Yeah,
excellent.
no, thank you all for being here and thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate everyone's energy. Yeah, thanks again.
Well, thank you, Jocelyn, so much. This is such important work, and I'm super excited to sort of see where it goes. And I want to thank everyone else for being here and for taking the time. This is our last speaker talk for this semester, but certainly in the fall, we will have another series. So if you're interested in these, keep your ear to the ground, and we'll have more to come. So Lenny or Kelsey, do you have anything else to say before we wrap up?
No, I just want to thank Jocelyn. This was very inspiring. And I had a couple of questions, but I'll talk to you outside the camera.
Yeah,
Thank you so
anytime.
much for sharing your work with us and for participating in our series.
Thank you, Jocelyn.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jocelyn. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.